Okay, good morning, everyone, and welcome to meeting number 47. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082, our study of the situation in Eastern Europe and Central Asia, 25 years after the end of the Cold War. And just before we get started, we had a chance to meet as a subcommittee yesterday, so just a little housekeeping. You have the report there before you. I just want to know if everyone's okay and we can approve that report to move forward before we get started with our witnesses. I'll give you a second there to read it. It just talks about a couple of individuals that was hoping to come before the committee, so we're going to send out an invitation to them and see if they can work with our schedule or when we meet. And then we are looking at studying the main estimate, so we're going to bring in someone to give us a little bit of an overview on that. And the last thing was that the chair had written letters to the chair of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, our equivalent in the Senate and in the Congress, to invite them to Ottawa. Those letters, or those were sent to you electronically over the last day. So those are really the four items on the subcommittee that we discussed yesterday. Does anyone have any issues with that at all? All right, then. If there's no issues, I'll just call the question. All those in favor of adopting the subcommittee? Okay. Thank you very much. So why don't we get to our witnesses? And gentlemen, as you know, we've been just starting a little bit of a study on the whole issue of Eastern Europe and Central Asia and the relationship with Russia. I've looked at both of your bios, both very shall we say, I won't say overqualified, but very distinguished, and we're looking forward to hearing from both of you today. And so what we'll do is how we normally do is we'll start with our opening testimony, and then I believe somewhere between 8 and 10 minutes each, and then we'll go around the room over the next hour just asking questions back and forth between the opposition and the government. And so I have on my right over here, I've got Chris Westall, who is a former ambassador and very much interested in hearing what you have to say. And then we have Petra Durukovitz, who's also got a great extensive knowledge on Europe and the relationship with Russia. So I'm going to start with you, sir. Why don't we start with your opening comments, and then we'll move over to you, Chris, next, and then we'll have questions to go around. So,
thank you very much. It's an honor to be here, and I would like to start by saying that, first of all, the challenge is to understand where the other country is coming from. And I spent more than 30 years of working in and with Russia. I am not Russian, I'm Polish by origin, but I will try to present key components of Russia's perspective, and later during the discussion maybe we will evaluate them. Let me present my points, answering 4 questions, and each question will take me about 1 to 2 minutes. My first question was, whom Russia needs today? And my answer is, those who will not interfere in Russia's domestic affairs or impose alien values, whatever the values they will see as alien. Those who will provide markets for Russia. And in this sense, North America, including Canada, is not a priority area. A priority area here is a vast territory of Eurasia. And those who contribute to her security. And Russia seeks partners in areas such as nuclear non-proliferation, terrorist pandemics, and economic security. My second question was, who needs Russia, as Russia is significantly alienated these days. There is a bit of the Russian hysteria around. So who needs Russia? My answer is those who want to mitigate any unilateralism. And that's the base for Russia's relations with China. Those who want to keep an open alternative to supply of oil, gas, and weapons. Those who don't need strategic allies that ties their hands, but looking for real politics supported, where the power is the key word to understand Russian policies. Those for whom security and stability trump democracy. And those who want more traditional and less diluted sovereignty. So, no matter how hard we try to alienate Russia, Russia will be not isolated. Russia will find her own friends because of those points. My third question is, what does Russia want from global and regional players, including European Union and those countries in Eastern Europe that belong or they are forming part of European Union. Russia would like to have influence in the belt around her. You may define this belt around her in different ways: zone of influence or zone of strategic influence. But the most important for Russia is to exercise some influence in the immediate zone around her. Secondly, Russia would like to keep control over all domestic, natural and human resources, and it's fiercely opposing any influence in this area. Thirdly, Russia wants to renegotiate relations with US and with EU. In this sense, Russia is, you may say, a revisionist state, because she would like to revision what she feels is unjust in behavior of many countries to her during the last 20 years. In other words, Russia is trying to be at the table, rather not at the menu of big powers. Thirdly, Russia would like to keep NATO at healthy distance, and in some cases, penetrate NATO exclusive zones, and to influence, and to have some influence over there. Then, Russia would like to keep US and EU confrontation at affordable level. Affordable level means without destruction of her vital interests, both economic and political. In this case, or in the same manner, Russia would like to keep China content, but without illusion of being a strategic ally to China. And Russia would like to assure Chinese that in case of deepening China-US confrontation, Russia will take the Chinese side. There is no doubt about this. Also, Russia would like to be an alternative to NATO security umbrella for potential partners. And here comes the Syria example. Also, Russia would like to participate in, and if possible, reorganize some alternative regional organization that have the global reach, such as Eurasian Economic Union, or Russia efforts to adjust the work of OACE. And the last question is, what are Russia's options with EU, Ukraine, and Central Asia? First of all, Russia would like to weaken the coherence of EU, because Russia prefers bilateral relations, not multilateral relations, much more comfortable with face-to-face negotiations rather than multinational forums. Russia would like to slowly break the barriers that are imposed by sanctions since 2014. And she builds very patiently selective relations and dialogues, those who favor re-engagement over continuing isolation. And in Europe, at least two countries comes to mind. First is Hungary, that makes a certain adjustment to Russian point of view, or Slovakia. And I believe that there are some hopes that after the elections, France will become another more closer partner to Russia. About Eurasia and China. For Russia, I believe the future is located in Central Asia. And in Central Asia, Russia preferred to resign from universal values, but rather focus on delivering public goods jointly with China, roads, stations, schools, and create a new patronage network in which Russia plays the significant role as a most significant partner in Eurasian Economic Union. To some extent, Chinese initiatives and the new Silk Road, One Road, One Belt, are overlapping with Eurasian Economic Union. And in this sense, it be a form of creation of the quite a big market for Russian goods jointly with China. But also, Russia knows her limits, and limitation related to her own economy and her own political influence over there. With some countries that belongs to Eurasian Economic Union definitely trying to be as independent from Russia as possible, and we see this in recent even weeks in relation between Belarus and Russia. Ukraine, and that's my last point. The only option available at the moment is Minsk II agreement, but possibly revised, because it was signed at the time where the political situation was different. And to my mind, Russia will be looking for U.S. support to revise this agreement or force Ukraine to comply with certain aspects of this agreement. In conclusion of this brief introduction, I would like to say that Russia is not for the beginners. Russia is a complex country, and easy solutions do not work. In case of Canada, we are not Russian priority, and Russia is not our priority. However, for many reasons, and I hope that we'll come back during this discussion, Russia is important for Canada for many reasons, not only Arctic, but other reasons. And our current policy towards Russia is haphazard, is zigzag. It's supposed to be a re-engagement. It is not. It's one step forward, two steps back. We don't have a policy towards Russia. And we may be, as I said, rather not at the table, but at the menu in case of closer U.S.-Russia relations. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Thank you, sir. Would you give us your proper pronunciation of your last name?
Piotr Dudkiewicz.
Dudkiewicz, thank you.
And professor at Carleton University.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Westall, I'll turn the floor over to you, sir.
Thank you, Chairman. It's an honor for me to address you. Since I retired from our Foreign Service 10 years ago, I have sustained an active interest in Russia and in Ukraine, and I'll focus on them today. You should know that I have served on the boards of public companies with interests in both those countries, and that I now chair Silver Bear Resources, a Toronto Stock Exchange-listed public company that's completing a silver mine in Yakutia, Russia's Sakha Republic. I'm also a member of the board of CERBA, the Canada-Eurasia-Russia Business Association, both the national board and the Ottawa board. That CERBA promotes trade and commerce across the region. But I don't speak for any of those outfits here today. I speak only for myself. Your subject is vast, and as you found, it necessarily includes Russia, because to talk about the security, political, and economic circumstances of Eastern Europe and Central Asia without talking about Russia is to talk about everything in the room except the elephant. I'll use my few minutes to talk first about the popular narrative of Russia as an aggressive marauder. Second, about Ukraine on the brink. Third, about the plans for détente of President Trump. And along the way, about Canada's roles in all this drama. First then, the common wisdom isn't wise. I encourage you to take a hard, skeptical look at the prevailing, ubiquitous Western narrative that Vladimir Putin is a demon, killer, thief, dictator, war criminal, and fixer of U.S. elections. Choose your epithet. And that the Russia he's led for 17 years is a malignant, aggressive marauder bent on domination in Eastern Europe and far beyond. Now, Vladimir Putin is no choir boy, no great power leader ever is. The president of Russia, though, is many other things. He's a patriot. He's a patriarch, Tsar light, say. Formidably intelligent, informed, and articulate. Pragmatic, above all. A proven leader, tough enough to run the vast Russian Federation. Ruthless, if need be, in serving its interests. And genuinely popular. Putin is also proudly a spy. And deception is an essential tool of espionage. So, of course, those little green men were Russian, but of course Moscow won't say so. As Putin explained at a Munich security conference, we're all adults here. What's more, beyond its leader, there is much we may not like in Russia's domestic politics, or in the unapologetically brutal, few-holds-barred way it wages war. But still, I find the current narrative about Russia's role in the world overblown, full of exaggeration about Russia's record, about Russia's motives, and about Russia's capabilities, while blind to Russia's obvious economic, demographic, and security vulnerabilities across its vast southern flank, 11 time zones, and its necessarily defensive strategic posture. That popular narrative is also notably ahistorical, ignoring the provocations which have led to what's labeled Russian aggression. The vast expansion of NATO by leaps and bounds, NATO, a congenitally Russophobic nuclear military alliance. The unilateral abrogation of the ABM Treaty, messing with Moscow's perception of its nuclear security, and the forward deployment of missile defense in Romania and Poland to counter a threat from Iran, we'd have Moscow believe. And the billions spent stoking anti-Russian sentiment and regime change in Russia's neighborhoods. There has been much blood shed since the Maidan picked a fight with Moscow 3 years ago, a fight it can't win. But the facts remain that Kiev can't make the increasingly distracted and exasperated West care more, and can't make the Kremlin care less. We are not going to fight World War III for the Donbass, we've made that clear, and the Kremlin, under any sensate leader, is not going to stop defining the geostrategic orientation of Ukraine, all of Ukraine, as a matter of fundamental national security interest. Call Russia's reaction aggression, if you will, but as we grew NATO by leaps and bounds, what did we expect? 3 years ago, what were we thinking? That Russia would just roll over in the face of an obvious strategic calamity and meekly agree to rent historic Sevastopol, the Crimean base of its Black Sea Fleet, from a member of NATO? Like them or not, theory aside, major power zones of influence are real. We Canadians know that. We live in one. In the real world, Kiev has about as much freedom to undermine Moscow's security as Ottawa has to undermine Washington's. Second, Ukraine on the brink. Take a hard look, too, at the catastrophic circumstances of Ukraine and at the record and results there of a quarter century of massive, sustained Western intervention, including our own. That record must surely lead you to humility about our comprehension of Ukraine and about our ability to mind its business. In brief, the Western colony in Kiev, the vast multi-billion-dollar project there, of which we're a vocal part, is a heartbreak. A corrupt oligarchy, unreformed, highly centralized, without even elected regional governors, littered with arms now, full of hard men without jobs, ready recruits for private militias, and dominated by ethnic nationalists bitterly opposed to vital national and regional reconciliation. More of the same from us will make no sense. In a hole, stop digging. At the very least, do no more harm. Our record proves that we don't know how to solve Ukraine's problems. They'll have to be solved or not by Ukrainians. For President Poroshenko, meanwhile, let us spare a prayer. With a 13% approval rating, the economy in tatters, and U.S. and EU support faltering, Poroshenko knows he has to do a deal with Russia. He has to implement the Minsk peace plan. Yet he dare not even say so, yet act. The Rada is adamantly opposed. In Kiev these days, federalism and decentralization, which are at the core of Minsk implementation, are four-letter words. We should do what we can to help him. We have very little influence in Moscow, and it will be some time before we recover much, but we do have some clout in Kiev. We should use it to counter lethally exclusive ethnic Ukrainian nationalism, to which we should stop pandering. We should use it as well to suggest such proven Canadian solutions as inclusion, as accommodation, and federalism. And we should use it to promote essential reconciliation with Russia. No country in the world has more profound interest in good relations with Russia than does Ukraine. None more interest in East-West accord. None more to gain by an end to this ruinous East-West tug of war. None more interest in a better fence between Russia and NATO, a mending wall in Robert Frost's phrase, and a new deal in which Ukraine, rather than having to make an impossible choice, gets to trade well with both Europe and Russia while posing a security threat to neither. A deal in which Ukrainians get the space and peace and quiet they need to reunite, to recover, to reform, and to succeed. By all means, bilateral and multilateral, that should be our goal. Third, Donald Trump, the world. Now, I haven't checked the headlines for the last few hours, so what I say may be far out of date.
You didn't check your Twitter?
But despite entrenched bipartisan opposition, President Trump has appeared determined to achieve a measure of détente with Russia, to fight ISIS with it, to trade with it, to seek peace in Ukraine with it, generally to lower the temperature and tension, to head off more Cold War. For the good of all concerned, especially Ukrainians, we should help him do so. Far from sacrificing Ukraine, as critics will claim, détente would permit Ukraine's salvation. And we should help Trump deter Russia, too, responding to his demand and that of General Mattis yesterday, forcefully in Brussels at NATO, his demand that we spend more on defense. In my view, we have to do so anyway, if only to build a Navy and Coast Guard fit for the three oceans we have to sail. As NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg insists, there is no contradiction between détente and deterrence. One day, one may eliminate the other, but we're not there yet. NATO's not going away anytime soon. It will go on balancing and deterring Russian power and ambition. Meantime, as we do our bit for deterrence, we should also do our bit for détente, and we should keep our priorities straight about the two. As Defense Minister Sajjan said at last year's NATO summit in Warsaw, even as we agreed to reinforcements on Russia's border, the work, quote, behind the scenes to reestablish a NATO dialogue with Russia really is the most critical piece. We need to make sure the tensions are reduced because it doesn't help anybody, unquote. Exactly. Détente is a lonely cause these days, and Donald Trump may turn out to be the worst friend it ever had. But the last thing our sorry world needs now is this new Cold War we're waging. We've got too much else on our plates, and we face far greater threats to our security and welfare than any posed by Russia. which faces them too. The Cold War blighted half of the 20th century. If we can avoid it, and I think we can if we try harder, let's not let Cold War blight any more of the 21st. Thank you for this chance to share my views and offer my advice. I look forward to our discussion.
And an interesting discussion I think it will be. So thank you very much. We're going to start with the opposition. Mr. Kent, you've got the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thanks to both of you for appearing for us today. And I'd like to start with President Trump's remarks yesterday. They're being analyzed in a variety of ways, whether or not as sincere that Crimea should be returned to Ukraine, should withdraw, Russia should withdraw, or a compensation for the national security issues that the president's had for the past week. When the committee traveled last month to Latvia, Ukraine, Poland, and Kazakhstan, there was concern in the first three countries I mentioned about the rumored or speculated warm relationship between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin. Yesterday's remarks and Mr. Putin's response to President Trump would seem to say that friendship is not likely to flower anytime soon, as did Secretary Mattis's confirmation testimony on what he would have advised had he been advising the president when Crimea was taken and eastern Ukraine was invaded. How, I suppose this is a hypothetical question, but how are both of you reading the Trump-Putin relationship as it may be, or it, Mr. Westall, from your point of view, has to be?
Good questions. What to make, as I said, I think that Donald Trump might end up being the worst friend that détente ever had. But when he says yesterday that Crimea should be returned, I would take that as a kind of an opening position in what will be a negotiation. The fact is, as the Russians made clear, and as is simply clear to anyone observing the situation, Crimea, short of war, will not be forsaken by Russia, period. So that's simply a fact that Ukrainians have to live with, and we have to live with too. Now, the legality of all that might be for decades in dispute, but Crimea will remain with Russia. And I think that is also genuinely the view, and was genuinely the view of the people in Crimea. It was taken without a shot. It was low-hanging fruit. Kiev had lost the allegiance of Crimeans. Now, as to the relationship between Trump and Putin, I think that's been a kind of a figment of the imagination and fevered journalism. All these references to a bromance. They've never met. Putin said that he thought that that Trump was colorful or bright. That word was mistranslated to be brilliant, but Donald Trump is colorful, and that he hoped he could deal with him. And Trump has returned the compliment, but there's no bromance there. And it's now quite clear that there has been incoherence in the Trump administration's comments about Russia, most recently comments about Crimea. The new American ambassador to the United Nations appeared to contradict the president. Mattis's testimony was quite at odds with what the president was saying. But I do think that Trump will defy all of the enemies of détente, and just bear them in mind. It's a vast array that goes right from all the angry Democrats, and I do worry that East-West relations are now entangled in a very bitter partisan fight in Washington, and that's very dangerous. But all of the foes of détente include the Clinton Democrats, all of the neocons who abandoned the Republicans and joined Hillary Clinton, McCain, Graham, and the entire large, powerful military-industrial complex that we all know exerts enormous influence. There's a huge range of opposition to what Trump would try to do with Russia. But I think he's defied a huge range of consensus before, and he will try to do so again. And I hope that he succeeds.
Yeah, just a minute left, but Mr. Bucharest, go ahead.
I would agree with all what Ambassador Weslow said. My few comments. First, at this moment, Russia-U.S. relations are at the very, very low end. I had the chance to ask that personally President Putin in October, and he said that this is the lowest level of trust between Russia and U.S. they saw since the collapse of the Soviet Union. So my first point is that it could be only better, not worse, because the worse is not feasible at this moment. Second is President Obama's policy towards Russia was a new version of the policy of containment. Let's contain Russia, surround her, impose sanction, and demand change of behavior. It did not happen. So the policy of containment is not an option for Trump administration. That's the second point. My third point is that I believe that people around Trump see Russia as a rather big player with certain weaknesses in economics and in the reach and so on and so forth, but in the sense of military capacity, which is formidable at the moment, diplomatic capacity, cyber war capacity, and other elements brings Russia to the level of potential partners in certain issues that only big countries can discuss and solve. Among them, it's a nuclear non-proliferation, terrorism, maintaining strategic balance, and preventing spread of weapons of mass destruction, and obviously center actions in the area of anti-terrorism. So that will be probably the areas that are going to be discussed if. My fourth point is that when Trump became a president, many Russians cheered, including Russian politicians. In the recent days, I see something very interesting. It's withdrawal from being so cheerful. As they started to realize that there is a lot of unpredictability coming from the White House. Zigzag, sometimes contradictory messages. And also, if there are not contradictory messages, the messages that are clear are not very pleasing to Russia. There is a danger of putting the wedge between Russia and Iran, Russia and China. And the Russians will not sacrifice their relations with Iran or relations with China because of the current policies of the U.S. administration. But this is a potential impediment to the successful conversation that will take place probably in May this year.
Thank you, Mr. Kent. Thank you, Mr. Ukert. We're going to move over to the government side, Mr. McKay. We're going to start with you, sir.
Thank you. And thank you both for your testimony. The first question I have is with respect to your analysis, Professor Dickwitz, was that what Russia needs, who needs Russia, what Russia wants from EU, and what's Russia's alternatives. What seems to be left out of your analysis is what the, if you will, the sphere of influence nations want. And it seems to me to be abundantly clear that, at least in the case of Finland, Russia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Poland, what they want is a close relationship with NATO and a close relationship with EU. And while that may be a disappointment to Russia, it is something that, in Western thought at least, needs to be have a paramountcy above what an empire might wish to expand itself. So I'd just be interested in your comments, because that's what's. I don't disagree with your point that Crimea, there's not going to be a war started over Crimea. I agree with that. But that's what's driving the fears on the eastern side of Europe.
May I offer the comment?
Yeah, please.
Absolutely, you're right. You are talking about Finland, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. With the exception of Finland, all of them former members of the bloc. Mm-hmm. They have fears, they have challenges, but also their fears are grossly exaggerated. They are exaggerated because if you will ask me a question about what are the security challenges for those countries, they will all answer. The biggest challenges is Russia. That is the common answer. But they have different challenges, and the animosity towards Russia is rooted somewhere else. The animosity towards Russia is rooted not in Russia itself. It's rooted with at least 4 reasons why they feel vulnerable. Because they feel vulnerable, and they would like to have EU, and in particular NATO, to be there, to be present there, and to help them. But they are misplacing, to me, a lot of their fears, because the challenges are in their domestic policies. All of those countries, in all of those countries, there is significant social disappointment for the last 20 years of how the transition is handled. First of all, and that provides this disappointment provides support for xenophobia, populism, and political cynicism, and to a certain extent, anti-Russianism. Second is distrust to the system. Many people in those countries distrust the system to deliver what they are promising. So instead of dealing with this, the replacement to this challenge is Russian threat. And thirdly, it's fear of unpredictability. All those countries that you mentioned, maybe except of Finland, are facing a lot of economic unpredictability and political unpredictability.
Let's say for argument's sake, you're right.
For them, NATO is the solution. Have NATO because NATO will save us from Russia. Be realistic. There are a couple of hundred NATO soldiers. There is no way that these soldiers are a counterweight to the Russian weight. But in the Polish or Lithuanian mentality, it's a very significant step. And probably they should be there. Only for the sake of this.
I would have thought that
peace of mind.
Let's take your argument at its face value that there's been some disappointment with joining the EU and the economies have not performed. But that doesn't mean there's a huge rush to embrace Russia. In any way, shape, or form. And in fact, I would think if I were a leader in any one of those countries, I'd be a little bit nervous about Russian military exercises up and down my border. That would get me concerned. And I realize that standing up battle groups in Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia is a glorified speed bump to any incursion. So the Russians could take you in half an hour, but they couldn't hold it. They can't hold it. And so the history of those countries is simply a pathway to exploitation and oppression. And so their history, their economic circumstances, and their realistic assessment leads them to what I'm hearing you say is an irrational fear. And I'm not sure that it is actually irrational.
Russian troops will be not in Warsaw or in Lithuania. There is nonsense. But I agree that there is a fear, and this fear somehow has to be contained. We don't like to have allies that are fearful and therefore unpredictable. Most recently, the chair of one of the Polish dominant party, PiS, asked for nuclear Europe. And he was rebuked immediately, within 5 minutes. But this is the level of fear which can lead to the certain actions that we may pay dearly for.
Professor, or Ambassador,
Yes,
sorry.
I just wanted to add, I think you put your finger on it. It's not the taking, it's the keeping. And I think one should take a look at not only what Russia's done, but what Russia hasn't done over the last decade. Just briefly, if you start in Georgia, Russia could have taken Tbilisi. It was ready to do so. The tanks were there, but it parked its tanks 30 kilometers away for a few days just to make the point, and then it drove them home. Similarly, in eastern Ukraine, Russia could occupy the Donbass in 4 hours. We won't speak of Crimea. And it's worth noting that the separatists in eastern Ukraine were asking Moscow for the same annexation that Crimea had, and Putin turned them down. Similarly, it was Putin who said that we could take Kiev in 2 weeks. And I think that's probably true. And it's no secret, you mentioned the speed bump. Despite our troops there, that the Russians could overwhelm the Baltic states very quickly. But they don't, because the taking is relatively easy. It's the keeping, it's the cost, it's the consequences. They're obviously enormous. It was a Lithuanian president not too long ago, who said that it wasn't a question of whether we take Article 5 of NATO's Washington Treaty seriously. It's a question of whether Putin takes Article 5 seriously. And he does. And he'd be a madman not to.
Okay, we're going to move back over the opposition. Madame Labadière, your turn.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to both of you for your very interesting presentations. And I think it is absolutely essential. So I was saying that you gave two very interesting presentations, and I think that it's absolutely essential that we see the situation from the other side and understand the limitations of Russia itself. We saw with the NATO mission that there is a risk of escalation every time we give a 10% increase to NATO. We see a subsequent increase on the Russian side. On Tuesday, we heard from witnesses that were saying roughly the same thing as you were. They talked about the need to develop a new relationship for security with Russia, and that Canada should be part of this, particularly given the uncertainty coming out of the White House. I'd like to hear your comments on this.
Ambassador?
Well, I think you're quite right. There is a risk of escalation. I think that, as I mentioned in my remarks, we need a better fence between Russia and NATO. The fence that has existed is highly problematic. And how to search for that new deal that I spoke about. From Canada's point of view particularly, it's going to be done multilaterally. Our contribution is going to be either through NATO or through the OSCE. And I think that I do hope that our delegations at NATO and at the OSCE are much more active and imaginative than they were for a decade there. But it's at the OSCE where you find the most relevant mandate to try to explore a security arrangement which includes all of Eurasia. So that's where I think we should put our effort. As Professor Dutkevich was pointing out, Russia is a vast and complex subject, and one needs to try to comprehend it. And that requires an investment in understanding, an investment in more links with Russia than we now have. Our links are very meager. I hope that you have talked to Russians. I don't know whether you were free to visit Russia. I think you probably were. But as I said, you can't understand what's going on in that region without understanding Russia. It is the elephant in the room. It is the major power. It is by far a more important capital than any of the others in the region. And yet we have imagined that we would isolate Russia. Well, one of the costs we pay for that is that we don't have any influence, and the other is that we really don't have any understanding. And I don't see how we can have a vision, some vision of Eurasian security, which it is our duty to bring to NATO and the OSCE, how we can possibly have such a vision if we deprive ourselves of any understanding of Russia. To try to understand Russia is not to approve Russia. It is to try to understand what you're talking about.
Agree. And if you allow me to answer in English, the threat of escalation is definitely there. Russia will be responding to anything which they will perceive as threat. And they perceive a lot of range of things as threat this day. And it is becoming the unpredictable spiral that may end up with a much worse situation that we are at the moment. I would second Ambassador Westall's statement that we know not enough about Russia. We cut our ties with Russia. Since 2010, even before the Crimean War, we cut our cooperation with Russia, technical cooperation in Russia by 2000, I believe, 2008. We don't have any serious leverage in Russia at the moment, but we had, and we spoiled this all in the beautiful way. We distract them. It was the point until 2008 that Canadian ambassador was traveling to all the Russian regions, and it was welcome, and it was a feast of goodwill to Canadians. Now there is not. How we can rebuild this? What can be done in a reasonable way? I'm not saying that we should all love Russia. Not at all. I'm saying to build reasonable, reciprocal ties that will make Canadian interests more visible and heard in Russia, not isolated and ignored. That would be probably what we shall do, knowing all the differences, deep differences between us and Russia. But also we should help Canadian companies. There are Canadian companies who lost a lot during the sanctions. Our economic turnover is $1.3 billion. $300 million. It's during the 1 year, we have less economic activity than in 1 day between Canada and US. This is how it looks at the moment.
Thank you. That's all the time we have. We're going to move over to Mr. Sani for his round.
Thank you. Thank you, both of you, coming here. I had some questions for both of you, but after listening to your opening preamble, I have more questions than I thought. So let's start with real politics, because I think that both of you are practitioners and you understand the reality on the ground. So let me start with you, Ambassador, first. You know, having traveled to the Ukraine, Crimea is effectively lost. Even if you look at Minsk I or Minsk II, there's no mention of Crimea. And I use a historic example of Kashmir, because in Kashmir you have a line of control, and that now has become the de facto border. So if we look at Ukraine now, their line of control in the Donbass, which is now temporarily holding, it seems to me that that area of the Donbass that has been taken over by Russia is now effectively being controlled by Russia. Aid has been given there. Structures have been set up because now Ukrainians don't have the ability to go there and set up just simple things, whether it's a healthcare institution or education institution. So Russians are ultimately providing that service. So without firing a single shot, effectively, they've taken over Ukraine. And as counterweight to that, to me, you raise a very interesting point that they could have gone into Tbilisi, but they didn't. So effectively, if you look at the region, they've heightened the tension there and kept everybody on high alert, which you know is not sustainable. You can't keep, and especially the spending on NATO, whether it's 2%, and going back to the professor's point, I mean, domestic politics plays a great role, but these countries can't sustain that kind of spending. They don't have the economy, and we were there. So effectively, Russia's game is not necessarily to take over by firing shots, but and second, on top of that, the presence of the Russian media in those areas, because some of these countries still have a high amount of ethnic Russian population. So if you look at Russia today and the other media that effectively in these countries, that's the only media they have. So not only do they have a military presence, but they also have a media presence. How are you going to resolve this going forward?
Reconciliation. As I mentioned in my remarks, it was noteworthy that the separatists asked Moscow to annex the Donbass, and Putin said no. He believes in the territorial integrity of Ukraine, minus Crimea. But there was a point there. Russia didn't get invaded twice, massively, through the Black Sea and Crimea. It got invaded across the plains of Ukraine. Russia's security interest extends to all of Ukraine, not just the Donbass and Crimea. So that's one factor. Now, the other factor, the Ukrainians are adamant about territorial integrity. Now, that may or may not in their minds, and in many of their minds, it does include Crimea. But even if it doesn't include Crimea, the insistence on territorial integrity would mean that Kiev has to come to terms with those separatists. And that is going to have to involve a measure of devolution of power. As I was saying, we should be encouraging that devolution of power. So Ukraine may have to face a very difficult choice. It would have been much easier for Ukrainians if they had inherited a more purely Ukrainian ethnic state, but they didn't. They inherited a state that required Kiev to appeal across not only Ukrainian ethnic group, but the Russian ethnic group, which was a very significant and remains a very significant part of their population. So if there is to be territorial integrity, it's going to have to involve devolution. And I don't think that Vladimir Putin thinks it's in Russia's interest to break up Ukraine for precisely the reason I spoke of. Russia's security interest has always extended to all of Ukraine.
So, Professor, you raised something very interesting, and you talked about Russia trying to seek markets. And you also mentioned the One Belt, One Road. And you mentioned Central Asia. We know that the One Belt, One Road goes through 3 Central Asian cities. To me, and you talked about reapproachment with Hungary, I would say even the Visegrad nations are now tilting in that direction. So just to, let's talk about real politics and bring it down to the economic point, right? The GDP of Russia right now is equivalent to New York. You talked about trade and partnering. You talk about Central Asia and other countries, but the trade and partnering that they're doing with is not with rich countries, not with stable countries. To some extent, these countries may not have the ability to pay for and buy Russian goods, whether it be oil, whether it be gas. But if we take a step back and we go back 15 years, do you not believe that it was a miscalculation on Russia's part because Russia feared NATO more than the insurgents of the European Union? That they didn't really think, well, okay, let's let these countries become part of the European Union. That's not important for us, the economic argument, but the more important thing is the military argument. Now, as you mentioned, is a revisionist history. Now they're going back and suggesting, well, now, hold on for a second. Now they're part of the European Union, and a lot of these Baltic states, from what I understand, are now tilting their purchasing power and tilting their economy towards Europe, whether it be electricity, whether it be natural gas, whether it be oil. So to me, I don't know how Russia is going to survive when the Baltics and other countries, the satellite satellite states or whatever you want to call them are now tilting their focus because either they're fearful and they want to join the European Union or they want to improve their own economies. How does Russia maintain that when their own economy is not that stable?
Just for, that's all the time, Mr. Chaney, but I do, we'll have a response. Mr. Dewhurst, that'd be great.
Thank you. I think that I should start from saying that this year, Russia economy suffered a sharp decline, 3.7% of the GDP. It's a lot. This year, 2017, almost by Western and Russian predictions, Russian economy will be back to about 1% of economic growth. It's not much, but still it's improvement. Russia budget is based on $40 per barrel of oil. The oil is now hovering around 45, 46, 40, up to 50. So means that they will have some surplus. This is still mostly a natural resources-based economy. Because it's about 60% of trade, it's in this area. But at the same time, in the sense of agriculture, Russia is becoming one of the biggest exporters of grain. It competes with Canada very successfully in this area. Also, it will become soon the exporter of meat, which competes with Canada in this area. I can continue. Russian economy is not as bad as we believe to be, A. And B, it's maybe not compatible with other regional economies, but still the volume of trade will be sustainable for some times to come. And obviously, for Russia, it's important to import high-level technologies, and that's Europe's camp. But also China. So this gives you a picture of the economy in certain troubles, but trouble not big enough to say that Russia is not the biggest partner in the region with China together. They can simply divide the turf in such a way that it will accommodate both Chinese and the Russian interests in the region, as far as the economic sphere is concerned. So that's how they are working towards this. Eurasian Economic Union is the vehicle for this advancement of Russia into region, not political advancement, but economic advancement. And I feel that this partnership with China will stabilize to a certain extent Russian economy, as Chinese are going to invest very heavily in Russian Siberian natural resources and in land. Where is Europe? Technologies. Russia needs European technologies if they will not come from other sources and sell gas to Europe. So this is the answer to your question. It's a concern, but the bottom of the crisis of Russian economy is already, to me and to other experts, is already passed by end of 2016.
Thank you, Mr. Saney. That's all the time we have. I want to thank Mr. Dewhurst, Ms. Westhoff for coming in and providing the other side of the argument. You've given us some interesting things to think about, and there's some good dialogue today. So thank you very much. We're going to suspend for a couple of minutes because we have to set up for a video conference for our next hour. So thank you, gentlemen, for being here today.
I like that. I like
Then we'll get started here.
Do they see us?
They can see me.
Can I say hello to Sam Sharat, who's my old friend?
Go ahead, say hi very, very quickly.
Hey, Sam.
Can you guys hear us over there? No?
Hello, Sam.
Sam, can you hear us? So, see, you're going to help us test this out here, but make sure it's working.
That's good.
Sam, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
Okay, someone wants to say hi to you very quickly.
Sam, Piotr Dudkiewicz here.
Hi, Piotr.
Be a nice guy today.
Okay, I'll try my best.
Okay, so welcome back. Here we are in our second hour talking about the situation in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And I want to welcome our two guests that are going to join us via video conference. I've got Anders Ashlund, who's on my right, and on our right here. He was a senior fellow with the Atlantic Council. Welcome, sir. Glad to have you here. And then we've got us joining us Samuel Chaparet, who was a senior fellow for Russian and Eurasia, the International Institute for Strategic Studies from Washington, but I believe you're joining us from New York today. So welcome, and glad to have you both here. So why don't we just get started? We're going to have both gentlemen give us your testimony, and then we'll go back and forth amongst the members to ask some questions over the remaining 55 minutes. So why don't I start on my left? I'm going to start with you, Mr. Chair. Why don't you start, and we'll give the floor to you, sir.
Okay, I just want to confirm that the committee has been given the slides that I provided to in advance.
The slides are here. We need to translate them before we can give them out, but the interpreters have them, and the clerk has them. We will get those translated and sent to the members in due course.
Okay. So I wanted to address one of the questions you put to us today, specifically about the way in which the relations between Russia and the West impact development in the region we're talking about. This is partly adapted from a book that I co-authored with Timothy Colton of Harvard University that was just released called Everyone Loses, the Ukraine Crisis and the Ruinous Contest for Post-Soviet Eurasia. The concluding chapter of the book looks at the impact of the regional contest on all the countries that we call the in-between countries, namely Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. And we argue in the book that across the region, a similar dynamic is playing out. Neither the West nor Russia can prevail over the other in their regional contest, while the contest itself is doing damage to the in-between countries. And so most directly, of course, that damage has come in the form of these conflicts, some of which are frozen, some of which are not. But in the book, we get into some of the ways in which the stepped-up contest between Russia and the West has hamstrung the transition from communist rule and political and economic reform in these countries. As you've probably heard over the course of your investigation and seen in your visits, these states all suffer to varying degrees from a similar set of post-Soviet pathologies: dysfunctional institutions of modern governance, partially reformed economies that lack functioning markets, weak or absent rule of law, patronal politics based on personal connections and dependence rather than ideology or coherent programs, pervasive corruption, and a close link between political power and control of major financial and industrial assets. So viewed in comparison with the post-communist countries that joined the EU in 2004, and that's Poland, the Czech Republic, Hungary, Slovakia, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, and Slovenia, which I'll refer to as the EU8. The in-between countries' disappointing performance since 1991 comes into vivid relief. And you can see that in the charts that I've provided, which the first two or three represent static measurements of governance in the 6 countries that I mentioned, and a composite index of the 8 countries that joined the EU in 2004. And across a range of indicators in terms of voice and accountability, government effectiveness, rule of law, political stability, regulatory quality, control of corruption, and including in the Transparency International Corruption Perceptions Index, the difference is pretty stark. And then there are a couple of the following charts demonstrate using both Freedom House's political rights scores and civil liberties scores, as well as the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development's competition policy scores, all of which have been kept since 1990. You can really see the way in which the 8 countries that joined the EU in 2004 took off, and the 6 that I'm referring to really lagged behind. And that gap sort of begins quite small in the early 90s and then grows dramatically over time. And finally, the last chart I provided was a comparison of GDP per capita using 2011 international dollars and on purchasing power parity basis. And there, the comparison is with Poland because some of the other EU 8 didn't keep statistics going back all the way to 1991. But it's pretty stark. Only Belarus, thanks to Russian subsidies, and oil-rich Azerbaijan are slightly better off than they were in the final years of the Soviet Union in terms of GDP per capita. Moldova and Ukraine are poorer today than they were when the transition began. When compared to Poland, of course, Ukraine's underperformance is particularly striking because it started with a higher GDP per capita and is now less than 1/3 of Poland's. Of course, many factors have contributed to this disparity between the EU 8 and the 6 in-between countries that I'm talking about. And the contest between Russia and the West was not the only one, but it did feed regional dysfunction in important ways. First, it's helped to sustain what has been called a partial reform equilibrium in many of these countries. In other words, these are economies that concentrated gains among a small group of winners at a high cost to society as a whole. And those winners owed their wealth to distortions and rents spawned by partial reform, and they used their economic power to block further advances in reform that would correct, of course, the distortions upon which their wealth was based. And so Russian and Western willingness to subsidize political loyalty have contributed to this phenomenon. For example, Russia pours money into Belarus through waivers of oil export tariffs and below-market gas prices, and it was willing to demonstrate similar largesse to Ukraine under Yanukovych. The West has also played this game, often in breach of our own policy of linking assistance to meaningful reform. Ukraine's current IMF program is its 10th since independence. All previous ones have failed in the sense that the fund has suspended lending because Kiev did not implement the required reforms. The notoriously corrupt Moldovan government would surely have gone bankrupt without more than once without its EU lifeline. And in another example, following the August war between Russia and Georgia in 2008, Washington committed $1 billion in assistance to Georgia, a country of fewer than 5 million people. So these financial infusions, which have been clearly spurred on by the regional contest, make it much easier for governing elites to postpone structural reform indefinitely. A second way in which the contest has contributed to the dysfunction is that it has exacerbated pre-existing political and ethnic cleavages in several of the in-between states. In Ukraine, the confrontation has mapped onto and intensified internal divisions over identity. Although those divisions were much starker before the war, and the balance has shifted somewhat since then. Regional schisms regarding membership in NATO and the EU, for example, still remain. The same is true in Moldova, although in a different way. Transnistria residents, for example, as survey research has consistently revealed, would prefer to become part of Russia than to reunify with Moldova. And even on the government-controlled territory on the right bank of the Dniester River, Moldovans are divided. As of October 2015, 45% favor joining the Eurasian Economic Union, over 38% who favor the European Union. And caught up in the sort of contest between Russia and the West weakens social cohesion and sharpens these ethnic and political divides, which have, of course, dented fragile democratic institutions. And the same, to a certain extent, is true in Georgia as well. The regional contest that permeates these countries has also warped party politics and, in some cases, supplanted democratic discourse with demagoguery. In Moldova and Ukraine, for example, parties and leaders have declared themselves pro-Western to capitalize on the popular desire for good government, which many people associate with the West. But when in power, they have all too often proven to be just as corrupt and incompetent as their so-called pro-Russian opponents. Additionally, the contest for influence between Russia and the West has hobbled Western efforts to support reform in the region. This is partly a function of practicalities, as I discovered when I was in government. When these kind of geopolitical issues are at the top of the agenda, other problems like reform or democracy sort of fall by the wayside. And at times when the contest is particularly intense, there have been examples when policymakers have deliberately downplayed human rights and democracy-related problems for fear of pushing these countries into Russia's embrace. One example is the EU backpedaling on conditionality with Yanukovych in the run-up to the Vilnius summit of the Eastern Partnership in November 2013. And since the Ukraine crisis, this problem has actually become more acute. The bargaining power of some of these states has sort of increased vis-a-vis the West, but their compliance with the rules and norms that have been promoted by the West has not meaningfully changed, and in some cases even decreased. Belarus, I think, is a case in point. In February 2016, the EU rolled back sanctions on President Lukashenko and his inner circle, as well as several state-controlled firms. And EU officials have admitted that in doing so, they ignored Minsk's non-compliance with Brussels' requirements regarding human rights on the reasoning that Belarus had become, quote, a battleground of powers. And the U.S. also joined this effort in reestablishing defense links with Belarus in March 2016. And, you know, this might be justified on the merits, but it does sap the ability to push regional governments to reform, because when you soft-pedal criticism of rulers who are, for the moment, pledging fealty, it feeds a widespread belief in the region that public censure regarding human rights, democracy, or reform is merely an instrument to punish disloyalty. And when when Western governments are inconsistent in airing those kind of critiques across countries or over time in particular countries, it undercuts those officials who do speak out about abuses or push their interlocutors to reform. It's easier for regional elites to brush off such concerns if they receive mixed messages or can point to double standards. And so by treating these countries as spoils to be won, we give sometimes the region's elites a foil against almost any expression of disapproval, the threat of turning to Moscow. In the case of Ukraine post-2014, where that threat is no longer credible, Western states have been reluctant to withhold public statements of support and financial assistance on the logic that the country cannot be allowed to fail. So basically, in trying to prevail over each other, we have a situation in which Russia and the West are neither succeeding in that contest between them, and the battle itself is causing a lot of collateral damage that has set back these countries that find themselves stuck in between. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Champ. We're going to move over to Mr. Ashland now, and we'll have your opening statement, and then we'll go right to questions.
Mr. Chairman and members of the Standing Committee, and thank you for inviting me to talk to you today on this very important topic. I will focus on your questions as they have been posed, and I will focus on Russia's intention and also what we can see so far from the Trump administration. The key thing about Russia's foreign policy today, it is that Russia has a strong sense of domestic insecurity. Russia has become an authoritarian state. Its authoritarianism is not very severe, counted in number of political prisoners, but it's quite efficient in terms of very strong surveillance of the citizen, which is just about unprecedented. President Vladimir Putin maintains a personal authoritarian rule. In his first 2 terms, he based his legitimacy on political stability and fast economic growth. But since 2008, Russia's economy has stagnated. With the fall of the oil price, Russia's GDP has, in US dollar terms, fallen from $2.1 trillion to currently $1.2 trillion. That is, Russia's economy today, in current US dollars, is the 14th biggest economy in the world. And at the same time, exports and imports from 2013 to 2016 have approximately halved. So the Russian economy is not very big. And the striking thing is what President Putin talks about when it comes to the economy. It's stability, not growth. And he counts the stability in large reserves, small budget deficit, minimal public debt, large current account surplus, low inflation, and low unemployment. These are the measures he is concerned about. That standard of living, counted as a retail trade or real income, in the last 2 years have fallen by 15%, does not concern him at all. It's stability that is important, not economic growth. Therefore, in its foreign policy, Russia does not have any strong economic objectives, which is rather difficult to understand from people coming from democracies and market economies. Instead, President Putin has turned to an old Russian strategy to gain legitimacy through small, victorious wars. The term comes from 1904 between before the Russia-Japanese War. And what we have seen in the last decade is Russia's war with Georgia in 2008, 5 days, small and victorious. The annexation of Crimea in 2014, a small and victorious war that was approved by 88% of the Russians. And the war in Syria, which has also been small and so far victorious. The problem was the war in eastern Ukraine that was neither small nor victorious. What we should expect from this perspective is that President Putin will poke more instability in the region. So the question is not if he will do it, but where and when he will find an opportunity for what he considers as small and victorious wars. This means that it's mainly countries in his region that are in trouble. He favors a destabilization, as we can see in the unresolved military conflicts in Moldova, Georgia, between Armenia and Azerbaijan, and now in Ukraine. We are to expect more such minor wars. The two countries in case right now are actually his closest allies, Belarus and Kazakhstan. While so far, as my old late friend Boris Nemtsov, who was murdered 2 years ago, used to say, Putin respects Article 5 in the NATO statute. The NATO countries have so far not been touched, and it's vital that that continues. So how would I describe Russia's main priorities and interests in Eastern Europe and Central Asia? It is, they can be described in 3 terms: geopolitical dominance, domestic political control through authoritarian rulers, and corruption. And again here, there are no particular national economic goals involved. Russia's main export is oil. The oil is quite unpolitical. Gas is a much less important export, and that is highly political and involves a lot of corruption. In what way do broader relations between Russia and the West impact the development in these regions? Russia wants to separate and isolate countries in the region from the West. Russia's interests are not primarily economic, but focused on geopolitical dominance, promoting corrupt and authoritarian regimes. So turning then to the Trump administration, what are we to expect about its policy towards countries in the region? So far, the Trump administration has said extremely little about it. The main statements have come in the last few days. On February 14th, President Trump's press spokesman, Sean Spicer, stated, I quote, "President Trump has made it very clear that he expects the Russian government to de-escalate violence in the Ukraine and return Crimea. At the same time, he fully expects to and wants to be able to get along with Russia, unlike previous administrations." And this was followed by a tweet by the president. I quote, "Crimea was taken by Russia during the Obama administration. Was Obama too soft on Russia?" End quote. This is, of course, in reaction to all the criticism that President Trump has criticized virtually all significant countries in the world, but not said a negative word about Russia or President Putin before. And he has just about mentioned Ukraine at a couple of occasions. What are then the implications of this for Canada? I think that for Canada, it's an interest in standing up for the common Western values in the region and for standing up for multilateral organizations. So what that amounts to, that is stand up for NATO, to maintain NATO as such. And given that the threat from the Arctic is increasing, Canada has all the greater interest in strengthening NATO when the US attitude towards NATO is uncertain. The second point is that the European Union stands for the same human values and democratic values that Canada stands for. It's important for Canada to get closer to the European Union. CETA is an excellent step in this direction. And then finally, when it comes to Western values, human rights, democracy, Canada has all the greater reason to engage with support of other countries that share these values. And of course, the European Union stands up as the main country that shares those values. And from what Samuel Charap talked about here before, of course, Ukraine is the tipping point. There's no country in the world that is at the same time so corrupt and so open and transparent as Ukraine. This is not a stable situation. Either Ukraine becomes a Western democracy and maintains its openness, or defeats corruption, or it goes the way of most of the post-Soviet countries into a mixture of authoritarian and corruption, because corruption is no choice, no accident. It is a choice of authoritarian leaders who prefer to enrich themselves at the cost of their population. So I think that this leads to a massive focus on Ukraine. Thank you.
Mr. Eflin, we're going to start with the opposition to Mr. Kimmich.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So thank you both for appearing before the committee. And maybe I'll start with Mr. Chair, so you talked about stalemate of post-Soviet pathologies. So I want to talk to you more, ask you some questions about what do you mean by the stalemate. We're studying the last 25 years after the end of the Cold War in Eastern Europe and Central Asia. And I feel like sometimes we lose focus that there's like a deep history that goes far beyond the last 25 years. There's historical grievances, economic ties, but also kind of historical ties between countries. A certain affinity some populations have towards either being recognized as more Western. And I have a bias here. I'm Polish. I was born in Poland. My family fled here in 1985. So I obviously have a bias. But the Poland I remember is a footnote in history. And many of you people who come to Canada from that area of Eastern Europe don't identify the same way I do in what I believe is the historical context of today. So can you talk more about these stalemates? Like, what do you mean by stalemates, these post-Soviet pathologies? Because I have a pathology, obviously, and it's more, I'll say, anti-Soviet Union, but it has a deep influence on what's going on today. So I want to know more about it. Which countries are you speaking of, and what systems? Is it economics? Is it social, cultural? Is it organizations that were created right after the Soviet Union's collapse that were meant to integrate economies better into the West that are not working today? So can you just expand on that?
Okay. It's a shame that the chart's not in front of you. So basically, I was making a comparison between what we call in the book the 6 in-between countries. That's Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, and Azerbaijan. What the EU calls the Eastern Partnership countries. And on the one hand, those 6 states, and on the other hand, the 8 countries, including Poland, that joined the EU in 2004. And the divergence in terms of reform, democracy, quality of economic governance is extreme between these two separate groups. So Poland is in a separate category in my analysis because of its relative reform success in the post-communist period. What I meant by the post-Soviet pathologies that affect the 6 is that there's a similar pattern of governance failures, of reform setbacks, of democratic deficits that is present throughout those 6 countries to varying degrees. And in the charts you'll see it's not all uniform, but that there are a number of commonalities and common problems among those 6 countries that, and your question is really about why do they suffer from them. A lot of it does have to do with the fact that they were fully integrated into the Soviet system for 75 years and only emerged from it in much worse shape in terms of social capital and the potential for democratic transformation than a country like Poland. But there are a range of reasons, and what the argument I was trying to make is that one of the reasons that these pathologies have continued in those 6 countries is that there is this stalemate between external actors, namely Russia and the West, in trying to compete for influence in these countries, and that neither Russia nor the West can prevail over the other, but that the contest between them is feeding into these pre-existing pathologies and, in some cases, making them worse.
My next question is to Mr. Aslan. I want to talk about this bargaining power. So for the past 25 years, a lot of these states and their politicians and the civic institutions, just civic society, people have been bargaining between and pitting the West or Europe versus Russia. So which country should we be more aligned with, and who can give us the better deal in a very broad concept? And we've seen Moldova and Bulgaria have elected pro-Russian governments who are more interested now in seeing their future aligned with Russia more so than with Europe or with America or the United States or Canada for that matter. And we've talked about this fear of states falling into the orbit of Russia. Does that mean inevitably that we have to continue being subject to this bargaining of politicians for domestic reasons, for their own local politics, or is there a way out of it for countries like Canada? And I should also state Canada is not a peer to Russia, and I know that previous witnesses who've appeared before this committee seem to indicate Canada is like a peer country almost, and economically speaking, we're far more successful than they are, but militarily and in terms of influence, far less. So what is it that Canada can do in order to either not be used, not be abused in this bargaining chip, our money, our time, our effort, our diplomatic resources, for it not to be used for domestic political purposes?
Yeah, thank you very much. To begin with, I think that all the EU countries, including Bulgaria and Romania, are safe. In fact, according to Transparency International, Bulgaria and Romania are not more corrupt than the old EU countries, Greece and Italy. So Bulgaria, we should not really worry about. It's more about what is down in the Balkans, but we can leave that aside for now. In the former Soviet Union, I think that it's a clear division that Armenia and Belarus are so far fully in the Russian sphere. Azerbaijan is massively authoritarian, and there's very little any outside power can do there until we see a serious regime collapse. And that leaves us with 3 countries that are of interest: Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova. What I would say is that they will all go the way that Ukraine goes. Ukraine is the pivotal country for many reasons. I mentioned here that it has the greatest contrast between an open society and extraordinary transparency, far greater transparency than the United States has, for example, really at the level of the Nordic countries. And at the same time, it's massively corrupt. There is a big fight going on against corruption. And the forces against corruption are civil society, part of the parliament, and the Western powers. And Canada is greatly involved in Ukraine, plays a very positive role. And thanks to the open debate in Ukraine, there is a big consensus between civil society and Western donors, and all the Western donors have the same view. The issue in Ukraine is not socialism versus liberalism, it is corruption versus reform. And the Ukrainians stand up for reform. And in order to get reform turning around in the right direction, we need to have sufficient amount of money so that Ukraine really may move forward. At the end of 2013, the public debt of Ukraine in dollar terms, US dollar terms, was $73 billion. Right now, it's $71 billion. Ukraine has got far too little money from the West while they have carried out very big economic reforms. So I don't see this really as a bargaining process with governments against the West, although there is such an element also. I see it is the West there when there is a real reform happening. And that's the case now in Ukraine for 3 years. And the question is, will the Western aid to Ukraine be sufficient so that the good forces inside Ukraine can win?
Thank you. Thank you. That's all the time we have. We're going to move over to Mr. Cito.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you for your testimony this morning. Very interesting. Since the landscape has changed in America, and there's a new statement almost every day from Mr. Trump's administration, Russia flexing his muscle into the Eastern Europe, and Mr. Trump's administration saying that we need to work closely with Mr. Putin. The way his personality is, and the Trump's administration is showing some sort of interest that they're going to use Russia to combat ISIS in that area. What's your take on that? The way I see it, Mr. Putin is very smart, very cunning, very powerful. In the impression of combating ISIS, maybe he wants to go into neighboring countries to have his influence, because he wants to keep his natural resources very close and accessible, marketable to the neighboring countries. So what's your take on that? Either one of you can take the question, or both of you can have.
Well, I can start. My response is that it's really a big question what kind of financial links Mr. Trump has with Russia. We know that at least 10 major dubious people from the former Soviet Union have bought apartments in the Trump Tower in Miami Beach or in New York. This has all been publicized. And President Trump has not published anything about his personal or company finances. There's a major question about what financial links there are between the Trump organization and Russian economic interest. At the face of it, this does not make any sense that Russia would help against ISIS. It's very striking that President Trump, in his inaugural speech, did not refer to democracy, human rights, liberty, constitution, Congress. These were among the many words that were missing, that are normally present in an inaugural rights. So it's a question of what values the current White House stands, where the senior advisor, Stephen Bannon, stands out with a rather curious list of values. And then a third issue is all the links between Russian intelligence and the Trump campaign that have also been extensively publicized. And now the Senate Intelligence Committee is clearly going to carry out an investigation by it. I talked to an aide last night to a Senate Intelligence Committee here, and he said that the senators, the Republican senators, were incensed that the White House had not informed them about this information coming from the intelligence agencies. So we are just at the beginning of this, and your question is very much to the point. And as I suggested, we can only see various lines in this. Thank you.
What's your take on the question, Mr. Schrapp?
What I would say is that the first thing is that we don't really know what the new administration's policy on anything is so far. So it's important to emphasize that not only do we not really have clear statements of policy, we don't even have key personnel and positions that would be able to either formulate or implement it. So, and that is a little bit unusual a month into a new presidency, but nonetheless, it is a fact. I think if you look at some of the statements that were made during the campaign by Trump and some of the more ideological people around him, such as Bannon, that Anders mentioned, you get this sense of the world that is sort of dominated by two major threats. One is China from an economic perspective somehow, and we can, the merits of that assessment are sort of besides the point. I'm just sort of giving my observations about what they seem to think. And the other is radical Islam, as they call it, / Iran, which is also the merits of which and the nomenclature is besides the point. I'm just saying what I think they think. And I think if you look at the world in those kinds of terms and you don't have a particular background in dealing with Russia, you kind of think that, hey, Russia might be helpful on both of these issues. Now, I think when you look at the details, it gets far more complicated, as Anders suggested, and I don't expect, them to have sort of a reverse Kissinger where somehow we're aligning with Russia against China, because I don't think Russia would go for that. But I do think that they came into office with this initial intent to improve relations, to see if Russia could be useful for them on their two big priorities in the world, particularly on the second one, on counterterrorism, as it used to be called. But what I would say is that the events of the last, particularly the last 48 hours, and the political pressure that they have generated, I think you've seen already affect their ability and interest in pursuing that initial intention of improving the relationship. If you look at the press secretary's statements a couple days ago, where suddenly Trump has always been tough on Russia and we immediately demand the return of Crimea, I think that's more by way of damage control, but suggests that that actually there's already been a course correction, at least because of the politics surrounding this issue, which is very intense right now in the U.S.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Sand. We're going to move over to Madame Lavadière for a round.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you for your presentations. I am going to go from 20,000 feet up to maybe 15 feet down. There's something, Mr. Cherub, do you hear me? Do you hear the translation coming through okay?
We don't hear you.
I can hear you.
Okay, good. So yes, I'll leave the 30,000 feet altitude and come down to about 10 or 15 feet, just to better understand something in your chart. There's a last line, which is a composite index, okay, right, which is always above 0, close to 1 usually, while the other. So what's the composite index? I'm sorry, it's the former sociologist in me who wants to understand.
Absolutely. So it's the average of the 8 post-communist countries that joined the EU in 2004. So their scores are average.
Okay. Thank you. Very good. One thing that is striking also in those charts is Georgia, which really stands out. Would you like to comment on that?
Yes, I think the Georgia does represent a partial exception to the region's governance pathologies, and to a certain extent that is a credit to the early years of the Saakashvili government, when a lot of the functions of the state were dramatically improved. And you see that in the regulatory quality, control of corruption, and government effectiveness. What I would say is that on other measures here, like political stability, rule of law, and voice and accountability, Georgia does sort of fall back to the at least the top of the pack, but more in line with the rest of the region. So I think what you've seen in Georgia is that there's been an improvement in governance, but that democratic institutions remain fragile. But nonetheless, it does demonstrate that you can, with the right combination of contingent factors, that these things can change.
Which leads me to my next question, and I just want to underline that I started in French by thanking you both for your presentation. So here it's done in English so that you can hear me. It's very interesting. We had a witness in the first hour who was saying also about Ukraine that, we've invested, Canada in particular has been quite invested in Ukraine, and but was saying essentially, I don't want to distort his word too much, that everything the international community hadn't led to good results. So do you have, because of the remaining level of corruption and everything, do you have, both of you, any ideas as to the way forward with respect to Ukraine and international support for Ukraine? What should we be aiming at? Thank you.
Yeah, if you don't mind, I would be happy to start on this.
Okay.
I've been deeply involved in the Ukrainian reforms. I've written two books and edited two books about Ukrainian economic reforms throughout the years. What I would say is that the current reform wave has been enormously impressive. Ukraine did macroeconomic stabilization 94-95, 2000 sufficient structural reform with deregulation and privatization to get economic growth of 7.5% a year for 8 years. And what we have seen now is a massive anti-corruption and stabilization effort. So let me just give you in a few points. First, energy prices have increased for households 11 times. And this means that 3/4 of the money previously of energy subsidies of 8% of GDP was given to a few oligarchs. This is gone. The budget had a lot of money that was straightforward theft. And Natalie Jaresko, as Minister of Finance, cut the budget deficit by 8% of GDP in 2015 alone. And that was essentially doing away with corrupt expenditures. Thirdly, head of the central bank, Valeria Hontareva, has closed in 3 years almost half of the 180 banks. And the banks were, to a considerable extent, corruption machines. They were taking money from depositors and the central bank and gave it to the owners. Ukraine has now introduced electronic, open public procurement on a big scale that hopefully can save 2% of GDP in more efficient and less corrupt public procurement. And we have also seen in the energy sphere a very substantial improvement of corporate governance, so that a number of top people can no longer divert the money from the state energy companies to their own pockets. And these are just some of the major reforms that have been carried out. So Ukraine has done far more to fight corruption than previously. What is missing is judicial reform. The courts are now about to be reformed. We should see a new Supreme Court being formed at the end of March. And that would be the start of a judicial reform. The prosecutor's office has improved, but only somewhat. And the police leaves much to be desired. And Canada is deeply involved in this. So I do not agree at all that this has been a waste. What I do think is that the Western money has been far too small, and therefore the Western impact has not been sufficient to tip the balance when it comes to judicial reform. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Laverdiere.
Can I add?
You know what? We're going to have to move on to the next round. Mr. Ariad, welcome, and the floor is yours, sir.
Thank you. My question will be for Mr. Aslan in French.
Our first two witnesses talked about an opening in Hungary and Slovak Republic towards Russia. Could you comment on this affirmation, and what benefit will Russia derive from this?
Hungarian Prime Minister has very much turned to Mr. Putin. We are seeing that he has changed the constitution in a not very democratic fashion, getting strong party control over all kinds of state institutions, including media and Supreme Court. So democracy is in danger in Hungary. With regard to economic links with Russia, the main thing here is a major nuclear power station that Russian state-owned Rosatom is supposed to build in Hungary with a major Russian credit in the order of 10 billion euro. So this is quite serious. I would not be so concerned about Slovakia. And as an evidence of the contrary, Ukraine now imports most of its gas, almost all of its gas, from Slovakia, which is contrary to the interest of Gazprom. The current government is best described as slightly left-wing, slightly populist, but I don't see that democracy is in any danger in Slovakia, nor that there are any strong Russia links. Thank you.
I will share my time with Mr. McKinnon.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. So I'll get right to the point. I love charts and graphs. And so, Mr. Aslan, you created a graph in last month's Journal of Democracy magazine. And so I want to ask you, because to me it seems a bit of a contradiction, and I was hoping, and I know, Mr. Charap, you spoke about this also. In that graph, you have 9 countries that have the most that their transparency is greater than the rest, and their freedom is greater than the rest. So for me, within those 9 countries, 4 of them are Visegrad countries, which are tilting towards Russia, and you have the Baltic states, and you have Bulgaria and Romania, who also have a pro-Russia tilt. So can you explain to me what the contradiction is, why the countries in that whole group, the ones that have the greatest freedom, the greatest prosperity, as compared to others, I'm not talking in general, but as compared to others, why are they tilting backwards? I don't, can you explain that graph to me?
Yeah, happily so. Basically, this is where they start from. What Viktor Orban has done since 2010 has not been fully reflected there. I would only put Orban as a pro-Russian. I don't agree that the other 3 Visegrad countries are pro-Russian in any regard. In the Czech Republic, you have the president, Miloš Zeman, who is clearly pro-Putin, but he has very limited power. The parliament and the government are not tilting to Russia. I've already discussed Slovakia. I don't see that as pro-Russian. And in Poland, we have currently some tendencies to follow Viktor Orban. And at the same time, we have a massive popular resistance in Poland. So I'm not concerned about that. In Romania, the problem is not pro-Russian. Romania has all along, by tradition, been strongly anti-Russian. Part of it is that Romania is of Latin language origin, and part of it is that under Nicolae Ceausescu, the Russian secret police KGB could not really operate in Romania, while KGB was overwhelming inside in Bulgaria. In Bulgaria, you have a certain problem. The president, who does not have much power, is clearly pro-Russian, but he does not have all that much power.
Now, you also wrote something else. You wrote, I think last week or a couple of weeks ago, you wrote that Russia has now achieved a certain level of, or semblance of economic stability. But can you elaborate on that point? Because for me, with the price of oil down to, less than $50 a barrel, and in terms of, the ties that their ties from the European Union are loosening. If you look at even their oil price, the only one big deal they've signed recently is with China to provide oil over I don't know how many years at $400 million US. So for me, how are they going to elevate their economy when the European Union is shifting away, the Baltics are shifting away. The deals that they're making now with this Eurasian Union is with countries that are not as strong economically also. So they may have reached maybe rock bottom, or they may have reached a point where they're not bleeding as much. But how are they going to elevate their economy?
Excellent question, and thanks for reading me so carefully. You have got it just right. The point is somewhat surprising. Putin does not intend to raise the economy. He intends to get his political legitimacy from other sources. All these authoritarian rulers do not really care about the economic growth. They care about two things: their own wealth and that they can maintain political control. And that's what makes Putin's foreign policy so dangerous, that he wants to extract legitimacy for his rule through small, victorious wars. I mean, the Crimean annexation was the ideal policy from Putin's point of view. Did it cost economically? Yes, but not very much. He could afford it, and he's very anxious to keep low unemployment. Unemployment in Russia, as we speak, is 5.2%, according to credible statistics. He's anxious to get inflation down. It has fallen from 16% to currently 5.4% in the last 2 years. These are things that he cares about, and he wants to have big international reserves. There are $385 billion, 1/3 of GDP, which is very impressive. And Putin hopes to keep his people quiet, not through higher standard of living, but through just tugging along. It's a very undemocratic attitude, and therefore, for us, it's rather difficult to understand that he actually tries to operate like that. But the point is that so far he's successful.
Thank you. That's all the time we have today. So to our two witnesses, Mr. Cherub, thank you very much for being here today, and Mr. Öcalan, thank you as well. And with that, that's all the order of business we have for today. With that, the meeting's adjourned. Thank you.